Welcome Management 6133 students. This is your week 4 lecture on the procurement process. This is what topics we'll be covering in the procurement process. When we're discussing the procurement process, this is just the basic procurement process. A buyer would receive a purchase requisition. They would then create a purchase order and send it to a supplier. The supplier would then ship the materials and we would receive them into a warehouse. The supplier would then invoice us and we would receive that invoice and send the payment. So again, this is a very basic process and we'll be looking at this process in more detail. So as within any process that we've discussed in this course, we need to set up data in SAP before we can start doing the process. So we need to set up information about our organization. And we've talked about the client, so this is the enterprise level. So we need to have that set up. We need to set up company codes, and most of the procurement processes in most companies are done at this level. We need to set up the plants, and this is usually where the materials are received that we buy. We need to set up storage locations. So we really haven't talked about storage locations yet in this course, but these need to be set up as part of organizational data because we need a place for where the material will be kept until it's needed. We also need to set up purchasing organizations. And again, this is something we haven't talked about yet in this course. But a purchasing organization is the organization that does strategic activities related to purchasing. So they do things like evaluate and identify suppliers, negotiate contracts. So that needs to be set up. We also need to set up purchasing groups. So the purchasing organization does the strategic part of purchasing, whereas the purchasing group does more of the day-to-day activities, such as issuing purchase requisitions, requests for quotes, purchase orders, that sort of thing. So we need to set up this organizational data to do the procurement process. So as we said, we need to set up storage locations. This is where we'll store the material we buy. We also need to set up purchasing organizations. One thing to keep in mind when it comes to purchasing, some enterprises have one purchasing organization for the entire enterprise. So one organization buys for all the plants and company codes, whereas some companies set it up where each different company does their own buying for all the plants under that company. And some companies set it up that all the purchasing is done for each plant. So they have a purchasing organization for each plant. Some companies take a hybrid approach where some material is bought at the enterprise level for the entire enterprise, and some material is purchased by the individual plants. And this makes sense. If you're a big organization and you're buying something that comes from one location for all your plants, it makes sense to buy it at the enterprise level. However, if you have material that's being purchased, locally, it makes sense to buy that material through the plant. So we also need to set up master data before we start the procurement process. And some of the master data we need to set up is we need to set up obviously information about the material, so the material master. So we need this, to execute transactions related to material. We also need to set up financial accounting data. So this is things like currency, valuation class. We need to set up purchasing data. So, which purchasing group is going to buy it. Things about the goods receipt processing time, delivery tolerances, and we need to set up information about the plant or storage data. So does the material, is it hazardous? Does it have temperature requirements? What's the shelf life, weight, volume, that sort of thing. We need to set up information about all our vendors, so who we're buying the material from. So general data, things like vendor's name, address, phone number, that sort of thing. We need accounting data set up for each vendor, so information about their bank, payment terms, reconciliation accounts, and the general ledger, that sort of thing. And we need to set up purchasing data for each vendor. So, how are prices determined for that vendor? How are we going to communicate purchase orders with that vendor? How do we verify the invoices? We also need to set up purchasing information, so general data about the purchasing information. So we put purchasing information in here, but lots of times we have specific data for specific vendors, and obviously we need to set up the vendor name, material numbers, communication information, that sort of thing. We also need to set up pricing information. So are there things like surcharges, freight, shipping, that sort of thing. So all of that needs to be set up for our material and vendors. So once we've set up our organizational data and master data, we can then do the procurement process. And again, this is an overall view of the procurement process. And this is a more detailed view of the procurement process. So something usually triggers a buyer to buy something, and that could be because of the material planning process. So from our sales forecast, we realize we need to buy certain materials to make goods in order to meet our sales forecast. Or it may be we get an order and we need to buy material to fulfill that order. So that would initiate the purchase requisition process. So a purchase requisition would be sent to the buyer. If the buyer already has a supplier in place, they would issue a purchase order. If they do not have a supplier in place, they would issue requests for quotations to various suppliers. After finding those suppliers, they would receive quotes, they'd analyze those quotes, and they would select a vendor. Once a vendor is selected, they would issue that vendor a purchase order. The supplier would receive that purchase order and then would send those goods to us, and we would receive those goods. Once the suppliers sent those goods, they would then invoice us, we would verify the invoice, and we would make payment. So that's the procurement process. For each of these steps, there's a whole bunch of data and tasks that have to be performed. So the first step is as we said, is after the procurement process is triggered, a purchase requisition is created and sent to the buyer. So in this step, the trigger of a purchase requisition is, as I said, it's usually identified through the material planning process or the production process where they need that material to make something. And the need for the materials is documented through a purchasing requisition, and this is an internal document. And the data that's needed to create a purchase requisition is we need to identify the item category, the quantity, the desired delivery date, and the location that it's needed. We'd also need to identify the material number, accounting assignment, vendor information if known. And so that information would be needed. Then when we have all that information, we can create the purchase requisition. And obviously the outcome from this step is the creation of the purchase requisition. So once the buyer receives the purchase requisition, as I said, if they know they already have a supplier in place, they would go right to the creating the purchase order. If they don't have a supplier in place, they would find suppliers that could provide that material, send them a request for quotations. The suppliers would then send us back a quotation. We would analyze those quotations and select a vendor and then send them a purchase order. So the purchase order step, so what a purchase order is basically a communication which we send to vendors, and it commits a company to purchasing specified materials. So the purchase order process is typically triggered through the creation of the purchase requisition or the receipt of a quotation that we accept. When we create a purchase order, the data we need to create it is lots of times we will reference either the purchase rec or the request for quotation or quotation, and that material that information can automatically be transferred over to the purchase order. But we need to make sure we have information about the materials such as weight, unit of measure, the vendor, the pricing, the conditions, all that sort of stuff. And again, most of that will come directly off the purchase requisition. So the task in this step is to create and send the purchase order to the vendor. It may also include selecting a vendor and communicating with the vendor to confirm logistics and delivery details. So once the purchase order is sent to the supplier will then send their material to us and a goods receipt is issued. So this is the goods receipt step, and this is the step in the procurement process where the goods receipt, which records the receipt of material from the vendor. And obviously it's triggered by a delivery from the vendor, and the shipment of materials from the vendor is accompanied by a delivery document, usually a packing list, and it identifies the materials and that purchase order that's associated with. And that's very important that you train your suppliers to make sure they put the purchase order information on the packing list. So the data we need to create a goods receipt is obviously we need the purchase order, we need the material, quantity, packing list, storage locations, receiving plant, and movement type. And in this step, we verify and record the materials included in the shipment in the goods receipt document. And the outcome is obviously the goods receipt document. This is the first step where there's an impact on financials. So the general ledger has to be updated with the debits and credits associated with receiving this material. We would then verify the invoice, and this is where we would do a three-way match to make sure the information on the purchase order, goods receipt, invoice all match. And again, there's financial accounting impacts. So the impact on the general ledger has to be updated from receiving this invoice. And obviously, once we've verified the invoice, we can pay the supplier. And in this step, they'd select the method and a bank, decide which invoices are ready for payment, and the payment would be made to the vendor, whether it's through a check or electronically, and the appropriate general ledger accounts would be updated. So there are some key concepts in the procurement process that need to be identified. So when it comes to material, we have to identify what item category they are. So are they standard material that we just buy and use and sell? Do we buy it on consignment where we don't pay the vendor until it's used? Do we have it shipped through a third party directly to the customer? Is it subcontracting where we're giving the material to create semi-finished goods? Is it a stock transfer where we obtain material from another plant? Or is it material we use in services such as general janitorial services? We also have to assign which general ledger account to assign the material to. So this is really important. We have to identify when we receive the material what the stock type of the material is. Is it available for unrestricted use? Is it in quality inspection? Is it block stock? Because it's damaged? Is it material that's in transit? And goods movement is part of the procurement process. So the goods movement, we have a goods receipt when we receive the material into storage from our supplier. We also may receive material through a stock transfer from another location. So these are concepts that are commonly used in the procurement process. And as with any process, the procurement process is closely integrated with all of our other processes. So we buy material to make it, we buy material to fulfill our sales order, we buy material for plant maintenance. Anytime we buy material, there's financial accounting consequences, and that financial accounting information is used in management accounting. We buy material to fill up our warehouses. We buy material for any projects that we are doing, and we buy material as a result of the material planning process. There's also lots of other reports we can create in the procurement process. We may want to have reports on the material that's ordered, material that's delivered, the value of our material, material count over a specific time, quantity of particular material ordered in the last 30 days, or the quantity of material delivered by a particular vendor the last week. Lots of reports you can create in the procurement process. So that's our lecture on the procurement process. I hope this helps you understand the procurement process.